Welcome back. So at the moment, you're suffering from stage 5 load shedding. You may know that one of the most important things about our country is that, by and large, we all use the same electricity network. It ties us all together. And that the transition from our current coal-powered system to a renewable system was supposed to take place with all of us using the same network. Now, electricity can be quite complicated, but it appears that that orderly transition may not happen. And as Professor Mark Swilling has put it this morning, we're now going to have a disorderly transition driven entirely by market forces. Professor Mark Swilling is the co-director of the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch. Professor, good afternoon to you. I'm going to ask you what you mean by, and what you mean in terms of the difference between an orderly transition and one that will be disorderly, driven by market forces.
Well, an orderly transition would be a transition that would be able to deliver energy into a national grid, and everybody would be able to be connected to it and pay for the electricity that they use if they could afford it. So that's the system that we've had up until now, which is coal-based. And an orderly transition would be how that transitions over to a renewable-based energy system. What we have now is the breakdown of that and the emergence of what I've called a disorderly transition. And what that means is carving up kind of energy islands. So big mines, rich security state communities, large rich households, etc., will be able to kind of sort themselves out and create their own, if you like, power stations to meet their needs at costs that they can afford and not many others. And this is going to be driven by the market dynamics. So the president announced in July that the cap on embedded generation is going to be lifted, and that really opens the floodgates for a whole multiplicity of private deals. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but if it's left to its own devices, it could reinforce the inequalities we have in South Africa with negative consequences and backlashes.
I suppose it also means that at the moment, in many people who live in a municipality will get some free electricity. They at least stay connected to the grid. They get some light at night. They get a little bit of television paid for by the richer people, so subsidized by the richer people, which is how it needs to work. That whole process will fall apart.
Yes, and it's already falling apart because the municipalities used to make a profit on electricity, and they would then use that to cross-subsidize other services, including free electricity for poorer households. That system is definitely breaking down. But if in a disorderly transition framework, what you have is richer households or suburbs and factories and big mines seceding from the municipal grids and sorting themselves out, leaving the rest of the population to somehow make do with what's left behind.
There also seems to have been, over the last 5 days or so, a big problem with the renewable, the renewable emergency power program that was being brought in, and some of the bidders and the winning bids were announced by the Minister of Energy, Gwede Mantashe, last week. Now, as I understand it, we were expecting a certain amount of generating capacity to come online, and in fact it will be much less than that because of a problem with the grid. What's gone wrong there?
Okay, so we have a grid which has been underinvested for many years, and it's oriented towards evacuating electricity where it is generated, which is primarily in Mpumalanga. So we have a substantial grid capacity in Mpumalanga, and then it's weaker and weaker as you go further and further southwest, like in the North Cape and in those areas. So it's generally a grid that is desperately in need of investment in order to rehabilitate after neglect, but also to extend in order to cater for new connections from renewable energy power generators. So that's the challenge that we currently face. So we were expecting 4.2 gigawatts of renewables to be announced last week. We got less than 1 gig. And that's because many of the bidders, at huge expense to themselves, could not get the necessary certification from Eskom to say, yes, if you build this power station in place X, you will be able to connect to the grid and we'll buy your electricity. They couldn't get that, so they didn't qualify, and so the minister couldn't announce their bids. So that's the problem we face. So the question is, why didn't they get those certificates? Well, Eskom is also providing authorizations to independent power producers who are not bidding through the REIP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program. They are going the private route that I was referring to earlier, and they also need to get onto the grid. So we have two systems that are competing with one another. And unfortunately, the end result was a disappointing outcome last week.
So does this mean the network, which would keep rich and poor people together, has lost and the richer people have won? I mean, that's obviously an oversimplification.
Well, that's what is potentially emerging. One of the most equalizing and unifying national assets is the national grid into which everybody can connect and access electricity. Once it starts getting carved out into islands of privilege where people kind of look after themselves, in other words, lifeboat ethics, then that national unifying infrastructure that is so critical for our nation starts to disintegrate. And yes, you're right. The poor will get left with, or the poorer or more middle-class houses might get left with a collapsing energy infrastructure with load shedding, and richer households, estates, malls, mines will be fine, and without any cross-subsidization.
In the meantime, NERSA, the energy regulator, has a role to play here as well. There's always a lot of shouting and screaming whenever Eskom says we want to put up power prices, wants to go up 38%. It's been suggested, and I think you're one of the people who suggested it, that in fact NERSA has not allowed Eskom to put up power prices enough over the last few years.
Yes, so NERSA does have a mandate to, in a sense, protect the public interest. And they've interpreted that as keeping energy prices low over a very, very long period of time. The consequences of only approving very low price increases each year is that it goes against what Eskom requires in order to generate the revenue in order to keep the lights on. So as Eskom's costs go up, that doesn't correspond to its revenues, which are controlled by NERSA, not by Eskom. And as a result, its debt levels have expanded, and it becomes more and more dependent on bailouts from the state in the budgets. In the annual budgets. And the more and more money that is allocated to Eskom in the annual budget of the government, that's less and less money for other good things that money could have been spent on. So the real solution is now, escaped us. We can't reverse history, but the right thing to have done would have been, over a long period of time, increase the prices gradually to a level that was more cost reflective. And that would have meant that Eskom would be in less financial trouble than it is now.
Professor Mark Swilling, thank you. Co-Director of the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch. Really do appreciate the time. Very, very tangled weave indeed around Eskom.